I made this painting in 35 minutes. Now, I didn't do it in 35 minutes just so you could go to the comments and tell me how good I am and how talented I am. I did it because I wanted to use it as an extreme example to demonstrate how, by understanding some of what I think are the basic building blocks of a landscape painting, you can simplify the entire process and get to the point where you can create something like this a lot more easily than you may think. Now, this doesn't mean that after this video, you're gonna go out and paint something like this in 35 minutes. It took me a while to get to this point, and I'm sure it will take you just as long. But the idea is to hopefully demystify and simplify the painting process for you. So in this video, I wanna talk about what those things are, how I approach them, and how I think of them, so I can hopefully help you understand the why behind the how. I think that once you understand the reasoning behind why you should do things a certain way and in which situation, you can apply that to any case, as opposed to having a step-by-step tutorial that you'll always have to rely on because you won't actually understand the thought process that goes behind doing certain things. And we're gonna use this painting as an example. I'm gonna show you some process shots from this painting, and I'm also going to use the final product to illustrate some of these concepts. And at the end, I'm gonna talk about things that I would fix in this painting to make it better if I had allowed myself more time. And I actually did a digital paint over on it so that after telling you what I would do, I can actually show you what that would look like. The first thing I wanna talk about is simplification. Value and composition are the two things that I think are the most important when it comes to a landscape, because they are really the framework that everything else is built upon. But simplification is also very important, and it goes into values and composition, because you can and should simplify your values and composition, not just because it makes it easier for you to understand what you're seeing in a landscape and translating it onto the canvas, but also because it makes it easier for the viewers to understand what they're looking at. Simplification in painting refers to exactly that. It's about simplifying the complex shapes and textures and values of a landscape. If you're a beginner and you've ever tried to paint a landscape, I'm sure you felt the overwhelm of trying to figure out how on earth you're going to capture everything that you're seeing. And the truth is that you shouldn't, because not only is it basically impossible to capture the amount of information that's in an actual landscape, but because by simplifying all that information, you will actually most likely end up with a much better painting. So I imported the painting into my iPad, and I'm gonna use this to show you how all of these shapes, all this information can be simplified. This is essentially what I'm thinking of anytime I paint, whether I'm painting from reference, from imagination, or from an actual landscape. So you can see here we have a decent amount of texture. There's all these bits and bobs going in. There's all this shape for the trees. There's all these trees here that go, they're very jagged. And the same goes for the rocks. Some go in, some go out, some come out like this. That's not what I'm thinking when I started the painting. I am starting from the most basic shapes that I can visualize. So there are two things that you can do to help you simplify a scene. This is especially useful if you're working from a reference or from an actual landscape. When I paint from imagination, I just think of these things. I imagine what those shapes would look like, because I'm thinking I'm gonna have a cluster of trees here, I'm gonna have a cluster of tree over here, and then I think about what would those look like in their most simplified form. The first one is squinting, because once you squint at your reference or an actual landscape, everything blurs out. All the details blend together, and you're left with very simple blobs of color and value. I'm gonna show you what that would look like using a blur filter on this. If we blur this to the point where it's just very, very basic shapes, all of a sudden you're left with no detail whatsoever, but only shapes. I can show you what these shapes become. That's one shape right there. That's another shape right here. There's another big shape right down here. There's this shape here. There's something going on here. There's this other shape here, this here, and then there's this bright shape right there. That's a lot simpler. It's a lot more approachable compared to this. These very, very simple shapes are really what you need to worry about for most of the painting. Towards the end, you can start refining these shapes so that you can actually convey what it is that these shapes actually are. But in the early stages, this is really all that matters. Another thing you can do is to use timers. I've talked about this before, and this entire painting is a perfect example of that. If you work with a limited amount of time and still try to capture the essence of your scene, you're going to be forced to let go of the details and really focus on the big picture. Number two is using larger brushes, which is again something that I'm doing throughout the entire process for this painting. If you use a very small brush, it's going to come natural to focus on the small details because that's what that brush wants to paint. But if you use brushes that are larger, that's going to force you to worry about the big shapes, the big masses of color. In the beginning, the only things that I'm thinking about are, what are my major shapes? What are the major elements of the scene? The trees towards the top, the background trees, the water in the middle, the rocks in the foreground, the banks of this water pool in the middle ground. That's all I care about. You've probably heard the concept of working big to small and general to specific, and that applies to everything from the details to your values, to your composition, to your colors. The next thing we should talk about is composition. And I'm talking about these things in this particular order because that's usually the order that you're going to be tackling them in. Composition is the arrangement of all the elements in your painting in order to create something that looks pleasing. One mistake that I see a lot of beginners make, and that I made myself, is that they'll just paint their subjects, their landscape, their reference exactly as it is. And the thing is, no shade to Mother Nature, but the way she arranges things in the landscape is not always the best it can be when it comes to translating those into a painting. So we often have to change things up, make things bigger or smaller, move certain elements so that they look a little bit more pleasing. And the way to do this right is by understanding how composition works. If you want a book about composition, that would be Composition by Outdoor Painting by Edgar Payne. It's probably the best book on the subject, as the title implies. It's a little bit pricey, but it's absolutely worth the price. And I got a lot of comments asking me if I could make a video specifically about composition and also values and also simplification and also a bunch of other things. And I will make videos about those, standalone videos specifically about these things. But if you'd like to know more about that today, I have something for you, courtesy of today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning platform for creatives. They have been around for years and they have so many classes about everything from painting to photography to gardening to business to marketing, many of which are actually taught by industry professionals, people like Peggy Dean or Ali Abdal or Marquez Brownlee. There is a class in particular about composition. It's called Art Composition Fundamentals, and it's taught by Marie Noelle Worm. And she does a very good job at explaining the basics of composition, things like note-end drawings, value, contrast, balance, etc. So if you want to learn more about that, that's a class that I can highly recommend. And one class I really enjoyed was Productivity for Artists by Brooke Glaser. It's nice to hear how a professional artist actually handles all of these things. She talks about building better habits and overcoming perfectionism and procrastination, which are things that I am very familiar with. And she shares some really useful tips, some things that I never even considered, that almost make me feel like maybe I can do this. If you guys start seeing more videos from me in the next few months, you have Brooke to thank for that. Something else you'll find on Skillshare are learning paths, which are essentially collections of classes that build upon each other. And the great thing is that you get access to all of this, all of the classes, all of the learning paths, anytime, anywhere. And Skillshare gave me a special link for my viewers, so the first 500 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. Before we go back to that process, let me bring back the actual finished painting so that I can show you some of those basics of composition. Probably the most well-known rule for composition is the rule of thirds. Rule of thirds says that if you divide your frame, your scene, into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, you end up with a grid that looks something like this. And if you use this rule correctly, you'll end up with a composition that's usually pretty dynamic and appealing. So how do you actually use the rule of thirds? Well, there's two things. First thing is you want to put your horizon line either somewhere near the bottom or the top horizontal line. That means you shouldn't put your horizon line in the middle. You shouldn't put it way up here or way down here. The second thing is that you should aim to put your focal point or your focal points somewhere around the intersection of these lines. So somewhere around here, somewhere around here, or around here. Now, this doesn't mean right on these marks. It means nearby. For example, this area right here, the waterfall and the trees and all this going on here, that's my main focal point for this painting. It's not right here. I didn't put it smack around this exact intersection, but it's close enough. It's in this general area. Another very basic thing you can use to make better compositions, which you can use with the rule of thirds, and I will show you how I did it in this painting, are leading lines. Leading lines are lines that lead the viewer into the scene. This tree branch is pointing inwards. We can also visualize another line right here. There's another line right here. All of these point here. And once your eye is moving this way, it comes up to here, and all of a sudden there's this general line that brings you to here. And there's my focal point. And again, there is so much more to talk about when it comes to composition, but using these two things is enough to get some very, very good results for your paintings. And again, like with all artistic rules, they can be broken. You don't always have to stick to the rule of thirds. There are many situations in which you might want to put your horizon line very high up or very low down, or when you may want to put your subject straight in the middle of your composition. That can make for a very dramatic composition. Movies are a great way to learn more about composition because cinematographers put a lot of thought into the way they compose the scene, because that's how they can make the viewers feel the way they want them to feel. Next up, we have values. And values are arguably the most important part of a painting. People, especially non-artists, don't see value. They don't think about value. They see a painting and they see color, they see detail, but values are really what all of that is built upon. Colors don't really matter as long as the values aren't right. If you've ever seen paintings that seem to use incredibly saturated colors or colors that don't really make sense, but still work, that's because the values are solid. Values are just as complex as composition, if not more, in my opinion. At least they were for me. But there are a few general rules that you can use to simplify the process of understanding how values work. The most basic thing to remember is that in most cases, things get lighter as they get further and further into the distance. So things that are in the foreground are generally going to be the darkest value, and they're going to be lighter in the middle ground and even lighter in the background. The other thing, and this is something that you'll find in Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, which is a fantastic book on the subject, also very affordable, a lot more than Edgar Payne's book, so highly recommend getting that. He suggests that the elements of a landscape can be broken down to 4 basic values. He says that upright objects are going to be the darkest value because they are receiving the least amount of light from the sun and the sky. Then we have slanted objects, things like hills. Those are going to be a little bit lighter because they're catching more of the light from the sun and the sky. Then we have flat ground because that is parallel to the direction of the light and it's catching most of the light. And then finally, we have the sky itself, or the sun, which are the main source of light in most landscapes, and those are going to be our lightest value. Now, this isn't true 100% of the time, but it's true enough of the times that it's definitely something that's good to remember. The general advice is to use anywhere between 3 and 5 values to capture all the elements in your landscape. Now, that doesn't mean that the final result is also going to only have 3 to 5 values. Because one of the reasons why values are so important is because they are the reason we can see form in an object. Any of these rocks were made with only 1 value, they would just look like a flat blob of color. But as soon as you add a shadow side, all of a sudden you immediately know where the light is coming from, where the shadow is, and it gives you an idea of what the shape of the object is. Once you start with simplifying all the forms, all the elements in the landscape, you can assign 1 single value to each of them. This will help you arrange all these values in a way that makes the painting readable, in a way that adds the right sense of depth. In this painting, I knew that the largest dark value shapes were going to be those trees in the middle ground. That's both because those are those upright forms we talked about earlier, and because the base local value of these trees is naturally going to be darker. Pine trees are this dark forest green, which is naturally a darker value than the color of these rocks. So as soon as I started to add opacity and started to solidify my value patterns and my colors, I made sure that the colors I picked were within that overall darker value. The values of different elements aren't just going to be one value. These trees are one value to start with, but in the end, there's going to be multiple values within those trees. And I know that's one very tricky thing for people to understand. It took me a while to figure it out, and that is that you have to keep your values relative to the base value you chose. So I knew those trees were dark. That's the overall value that I wanted them to have. But they're still going to have shadow shapes and lighter shapes. But those darker and lighter shapes shouldn't be too much darker or too much lighter when compared to the base value that I chose. Because if they are, then the entire thing is gonna fall apart. Now that we're a little further ahead with the painting, it's time to talk about color. I get a surprising amount of questions and people asking for advice on how to pick colors, how do I mix colors, how do I choose colors? And believe it or not, I used to massively struggle with color. The best resource I ever found for color, and this is something you'll hear a lot of other artists recommend, is the book Color and Light by James Gurney. Side note, James Gurney's on YouTube too. Go and watch all of his videos. He's incredible and he has so much content where he talks about this kind of stuff. His book does a fantastic job at explaining how light and color work together. And that's really one of the best ways to get better at color, is understanding how light actually affects things, how it affects surfaces, how light makes colors bounce around different elements. Because once you understand how light behaves, you'll have a much easier time capturing the way that the landscape is and even approximating the way things should be if you can't really see them, which is especially useful if you're working from imagination or from a photo reference. As for this painting, my first thought related to color was, what kind of mood do I want to convey? I wanted this painting to feel gloomy but inviting. I also knew I wanted it to feel lush and humid and fresh. It was gonna have quite a lot of greens, but I wanted those greens to feel maybe not muted, but more of the neutral or natural type. My number one piece of advice when it comes to color is to avoid using color straight from the tube. That doesn't mean you need to mix every single color. So what I did for a lot of these colors was I started with a color that was straight from the tube that I had on my palette, but then I added bits of different colors to that color. I started with some olive green for the trees, for example, and then added a bit of Naples yellow. I added a bit of ultramarine blue. I added a bit of buff titanium or red iron oxide. And all of these little additions will shift the hue of that color a little bit and make it just that much more interesting. And as long as you keep those color shifts subtle enough, they will be noticeable, but not to the point where they stand out in a bad way. They will help you create this vibrancy, this variety, and that's how you end up with things that aren't just green, but a variety of greens. Because very few things in the landscape are just one color. We think of trees as green and rocks as gray, but there are thousands of different hues of green within those trees. There are thousands of different types of gray. There are bluish grays, purplish grays, warm, cool grays, green grays. So try to play around with these colors, and the next time you're outside, actually look, take some time to look at trees, at the sky, at mountains. See if you can spot colors that aren't the colors that you expect. If you just glance at a mountain, it'll just look brown or green. But if you stay there for a while and keep looking at it, it will eventually start to show you some purples, some blues, some reds, some yellows, some grays. And when it comes to painting, you can push those subtle colors. Another tip I have is to use the colors that you've already mixed to add to newly mixed colors. For example, when I was mixing the color for these rocks, I picked up some of the color that I had mixed for the trees. And by adding that color to the mix that I made for the rocks, it brought in some of that greenish tint, and it helped those rocks feel more unified with the rest of the painting. And the same goes for the trees, for the background sky and the background trees, for the water. And then I often do things that are more related to some color theory principles and my understanding of how light and colors behave to make some color choices that aren't so obvious. A good example would be the reddish, brown, orangey areas in the trees and the ground in the distance. I know that red and green are complementary colors, so I choose to use some orangey, reddish colors. Sometimes it's more red, sometimes it's more orange, sometimes it's a very dark brown that leans towards red or orange. And I pepper those in here and there to add some sort of vibrancy to these greens. Adding their complementary color helps them come alive. And I often actually mix them in with the green, although you have to be a little bit more careful with that, because if you take a color and add its complementary to it, it will desaturate that color, it will mute it down. But that's something that I'm okay with in some cases. I want some of these greens to be less saturated, to stand out a little bit less. And the other thing, which is what you can see in the rocks, is that sort of purplish, bluish hue. I'm doing that because I know that wet rocks will often catch some of the color from the sky, which in this case is this sort of cool gray. So that cool gray added to the color of these rocks results in a sort of purple. It wouldn't be nearly as noticeable in real life, but I choose to push it to add a little bit of color variation. Again, I couldn't recommend color and light any more than I already have. We'll teach you a lot more of this kind of stuff. So at this point, the painting is mostly done, or rather, I'm about to run out of time. I actually gave myself 30 minutes to do this, but I went a few minutes over because I was trying to tighten things up. So the last few steps that I allowed myself were to just add a few touches of contrast, a few more details, just clean up some of the shapes and edges that I was seeing to try and get to what I had in mind. But again, 30 minutes, 35 minutes was still not enough to get quite what I wanted. And there were a few things that I would have done differently if I had had another 15 to 20 minutes. So we're gonna take the painting and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the things that I would adjust if I had a little bit more time. And then once I'm done, I'm gonna show you the paint over I did, where I actually did spend an extra 15 minutes fixing those things, so you can see what the final result would actually look like. The number one thing that I noticed here is that these rocks and this general area here in the foreground is far too light. As I mentioned before, things in the foreground are supposed to be darker, not just because they're closer to the viewer and they don't suffer from atmospheric perspective, but also because they're generally not the focal point, especially not in this case. This is my focal point. So by making things a little bit darker, they kind of fall off. They become less important to the viewer. So that's one thing that I would like to do. I would darken all of this to make them less noticeable, make them a little closer to the foreground, and add a little bit more depth. I would also darken the water in these areas here. You can already tell it's quite darker in this area here and here compared to here. I would push that further, both to indicate the reflections from these trees here, which would reflect in the water here and here, and also again to fade those areas off a little bit more. Number three is I would adjust the shapes of these trees. This in particular, it's a very, very basic, just square shape. There's not a lot of things going on here. So I would adjust the shape of this tree here, add a few more sky holes to make it a little bit more interesting, add depth and show more of that background there. Same thing on the trees on this side. On another note, for the trees, I would add more tree trunks to break up the monotony of the spacing of these trees. Right now, they're very, very evenly spaced. Right here, we have one here, one here, one here. There's not a lot of variety here. So I would add maybe clusters of 3 trees here, maybe 2 here, maybe a couple other trees here, just to break it up and make it a little bit more natural. I would also like to do something with this waterfall here. It's a very simple shape. I would like to make it a little bit more interesting, maybe by adding some rocks here in the foreground to cover up some of the waterfall and make it appear to have a different shape. And then finally, I would probably just add a few touches of some darker values, some lighter values, maybe some smaller bits of rocky colors here, just to break up and add some semblance of detail to this area right around here. Oh, and finally, one last thing. These background trees are very, very simple. I would like to darken some of the bottom areas just to give them a little bit more form and depth. And on top of that, it would also help this waterfall stand out more, because right now the value of the waterfall and the value of these trees are pretty close to one another. This one is still considerably lighter than this, but by darkening this area here, this connection, I think that would help the waterfall stand out and it would bring the eye in a little bit more. I'm gonna go ahead and do a digital paint over of this so that I can show you what that would actually look like. So here's the before and after, so you can compare the original painting with the changes that I made to it. Again, I only spent about 15 minutes on this paint over. It could be better. I could spend another 3 hours really refining this, really cleaning it up and making it as good as it could possibly be. But that wasn't the goal of this. I might use this in the future for a better, more refined painting, but for the purpose of this, I'm very happy with the way it turned out. I really hope you found this video helpful. Hopefully it explained some of the concepts related to landscape painting that maybe you were struggling with. If you have any questions, as usual, leave them down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you next time.